Now we will switch to our next panel. I'll pass the floor to Dan Bilak, head of UkraineInvest, who's been attracting international investment here for the last several years, and his representatives of the government, central bank, and the IMF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. I think we need one more chair up before we call up the president. Left his notes here. Maybe I'll just repeat those. That's right. It could be a national security issue. Yeah, I don't want to get into that. Before I introduce the rest of our panel, first of all, I'd like to thank Tomasz Dragon Capital for inviting me to moderate this panel with my colleagues and friends and fellow people on the barricades trying to move this country forward. And I'm very grateful to Ambassador Mingarelli and to Mr. Bildt for their previous comments, because I think it puts a very, very good context, puts our situation in a very good context. And now we will have the government officials that you can cross-examine as to many of the issues that they raised. What was interesting was there was an allusion to Ukraine House in Davos, and UkraineInvest sponsored an entire day called Invest Day. Which was very interesting, because I got some new messages from business that I'm now using when I talk to investors. The first one was from Sir Suma Chakrabarty, the president of the EBRD, who said, because of Ukraine's reforms, Ukraine is now open for business. And then we had other investors, many of them in the renewable sector, but not just in the renewable sector. ArcelorMittal, who is our largest investor in the country, said that the reforms have produced a stable and predictable emerging market, the largest one in Europe, and that this is now a place where you can make money, which is also a key takeaway. And the third takeaway was from my friend Lena Kazarny, who has just announced through Horizon Capital a $200 million fund, saying, we put this fund together, and she closed during martial law, so you can tell kind of the interest that was in among investors in this. That we closed this fund, and we're moving forward because asset prices are so low in Ukraine now that if you get in now, you'll make a lot of money. And this is very interesting, because what we're looking at today, I think, is where is Ukraine in the global scheme of things? So we move from the reform process is not done in isolation, clearly. So we were looking at not just how do global trends affect Ukraine, but how does Ukraine also impact on global trends? And we have these challenges that we're up against. We have populism, which is not unique to Ukraine. I think one of the key differences between Ukrainian populism and the populism in other parts of Europe is that in Ukraine, the populists have about 14% of the vote, where in the rest of Europe and more established places, they have 40% of the vote. So in our election campaign, there's lots of things to play for all of the candidates, since most of the people aren't fully decided. We have the end of quantitative easing and the rise of interest rates and all of these macroeconomic issues globally that are going to be pressing on emerging markets, not just in Ukraine. And I think in this backdrop, I'd like to invite my panel up, because I think this is where we want to start our discussion. I'd ask Yakiv Smolii, who's the governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. Oksana Markarova, the Minister of Finance, Oleksandr Saienko, Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers. That in Ukraine means Minister of just about every major priority reform, so you can ask lots of questions to him. And Ljungman, who's representative of the IMF, not a disinterested party in all of this discussion. Thank you very much for joining us today. In this picture that I painted, I think the first question, I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Smolii, and it will be in Ukrainian. So those of you who don't speak Canada's other official language, you can put your headphones on. Нема за що. Ви тільки що
You just finished the survey of your stakeholders of the National Bank, and you asked the question, what are their concerns for 2019 in Ukraine? It's interesting that 56% of them said that their concern is the result of the presidential and the outcome of presidential and parliament campaigns. 19% said investor right protection, 12% how Ukraine is going to pay its external debt, 8% the impact of global economy, the slowdown of global economy on Ukrainian economy. Only 4% were concerned with Russian aggression. It's an interesting outcome because 56% are concerned with the elections and almost 42% were about economic questions that turn around the issue of what we're going to do with the external debt. And that means that financial stability, despite the fact that many things have already been done, financial stability is still a matter of concern for people. So what do you think what should be the policy of the National Bank for future in this turbulent period of 2019 in terms of macroeconomic and financial stability of the country? Thank you for your question. It is true that we had a meeting in early 2019 and there was this survey done, and they do speak to what you said, that the main challenges are parliamentary and presidential election, and this is the concern for the business and stakeholders of the NBU. But also other things that you mentioned are relevant, and something that I would like to present in terms of the result of 2018 and further policy for 2019. What the President and the Prime Minister mentioned in their presentations, Ukraine, for the last 7 years, has achieved the growth of GDP at a level of 3.4%. At the end of February, we'll get exact number from statistics. We have one-digit inflation. This is the third or the second year consecutive. We have macroeconomic stability. For the last 5 years, we have had the highest level of golden reserves, 21 billion at the beginning of this year. And I think this is the first time for the history of Ukraine that the banking sector was emphasized. 20 billion at the end of the year is the best result after provisioning, and I think this is a matter of pride both for the National Bank as a regulator, and also we have representatives, the bankers here. The current year, according to our estimate, and the mandate according to the law of the NBU is to sustain macroeconomic stability. We think that by the end of the year we will see the downfall of inflation to 6.3%. As of January, our trend and forecast is proven to hit that trajectory, which may lead us to that indicator, 6.3 at the end of the year. The economy is going to grow, maybe not as fast as 2018, but there still will be an upward trend. We forecast that golden and currency reserve is going to be on the same level as of the end of 2018. 2018, about $20 billion, and the prerequisite for this is the new IMF standby program and our agreements with the European Union and the guarantees of the World Bank that would allow us to replenish the golden reserves from international organizations. We said that our banking system has a revenue, and there is a trust from general public which is growing both to the banking products and credit portfolio. And one of the tasks for 2019 is to restore the crediting for corporate clients, because private and medium-sized business has increased significantly in 2018, unlike the former. And the year of 2019 has the biggest challenge are the elections, as I said, and this is something that alarms everyone, and that may lead to some unpredictable outcomes. There's also every ground to think that if the inflation is going to be within the corridor, we may use the softening of the monetary policy in 2019. We still remain a professional, independent institution, and this is proven by the result of a rigid monetary policy. There's no any influence neither from the politicians nor from the aspiring candidates. Can I interrupt you, because I think that for our audience that's an important issue. What we see in other countries is how populistic governments are acting. The deputy prime minister is saying in Italy that they may take the golden reserves and just cover all of our problems. And you can imagine what our audience would have thought of this if any of our government leaders in Ukraine would have said that. Are you not afraid that the independence that you managed to achieve with such a rigid standing for your legislative mandate, do you think it is somehow endangered by this election process? Well, the National Bank is acting according to the law on National Bank, and the law on National Bank specifies the governance mandate, the board of the National Bank, the members of the governing board. There is a procedure of appointment and dismissal. Should we stick to the letter of the law and legislative and the rule of law, which is proclaimed by all the running candidates, I don't think there is any danger of infringing on the independence of National Bank. Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you and we'll give you an opportunity to continue.
This discussion. I mean, my father always said, if there's an elephant in the room, you should introduce it. So let's talk about the IMF, and because I'm sure that's what on everybody's mind. Nothing personal. Josta, we'll get to you in a moment as well. We just went through a very difficult process, long, difficult process that led to a lot of speculation in the marketplace about, when is Ukraine going to sign the IMF, etc. And we finally did it. And what does this mean for Ukraine actually for 2019, including this so-called period of political instability tied to the election campaigns and other external factors? What does the Ministry of Finance see as having obtained with the IMF program?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think it's crucial for us to understand that we are in the 12th quarter of subsequent economic growth. And we have achieved it because we stayed firmly on the path of fiscal consolidation, because we were disciplined, because the National Bank, probably for the first time in Ukraine, during the past 4 years, was truly independent institution that added to this macroeconomic stability. And this is the backdrop for any future growth acceleration, which is our priority. So we all know that we got the economy in the state that we got. And of course, there were some dramatic bad developments as the result of the war, attack, loss of Crimea and everything else. But that is not the only reason why Ukrainian economy was very weak in 2014. Ukrainian economy for the previous 20 years was not running properly. There were huge fiscal imbalances in the system. The reforms that were supposed to be done in early 90s were not done. The privatization did not happen. There is so much that didn't happen, and it's still not resolved fully. So for us, it's very important that to have our trusted partners like IMF, like the World Bank and others, because we have all these fiscal imbalances were covered by the sometimes irresponsible borrowing. So we do have a huge debt which we have to manage, which we have to pay, and which we have to, in the next 3 years, we have the highest 3 years of the debt repayments and services. Being in the program, in the IMF program, for us means that there are sound policies in place, which first and foremost, of course, the government priority, not the IMF priority. They are supported by the IMF, they are supported by the World Bank, they are supported by the European Union, but first and foremost, this is what is right for Ukraine. This is what we need to do in order to continue move forward, in order to improve the investment climate, in order to attract investors into Ukraine, and in order to accelerate economic growth. I think it's a very good sign that IMF showed that they are really a true partner of Ukraine, because it's not very easy to enter into a new program before the year of 2 elections. IMF has provided us with the 14 months program, which will cover us essentially throughout 2019 and until the new government will be formed, after the parliamentary elections will be completed, after the new coalition will be built at the end of 2019. So I think it's a very good signal to investors that we continue on the path of reforms, that the government continues to reform not only the economy, not only the financial or budgetary sphere, but essentially all the rest, the pension reform, the education reform, the healthcare reform, everything else, and that it's really a good time for investors to look at Ukraine, because not if, when we stay on this path, in a couple of years, the situation will be much better, the inflation will be lower, the economic growth will be higher, and it's going to be too late to invest, or it's going to be too expensive.
So, Oksana, are you, from what you're saying, do I read into that the government is going to continue prioritizing borrowings from the official sector, from IFIs, or are you going to go more into the market and try to tap the capital markets?
Well, what we also did differently, and I think we're moving into 3-year midterm perspective in everything. We are working on our first 3-year budget resolution right now, but we already published and adopted our midterm debt management strategy, which I think, again, is something new for Ukraine. So in that strategy, we have all our plans, we have the financing need, and we clearly show where we want to go. We want to decrease the debt as the percentage to GDP. We have a very ambitious goal to have it under 50% in 3 years. It's very important because if we look from the global perspective, again, we are not on the island, the global economy situation is a bit worrisome. And there are risks that countries that have higher debts, that countries that are not sustainable will be more prone to these shocks. So we are preparing ourselves to improve the situation inside, but also to be prepared for the global situation. But it's not only about that. I think if we are to talk about what do we need to do in order to accelerate growth, because we heard today that we need to combat poverty. We need our people to see the result and to feel the result of the reforms that the President and the government and the Verkhovna Rada has been doing for this 3-4 years. In order to do that, we need still to address a lot of structural imbalances. We need to improve the productivity. There was a great report that we just recently presented together with the World Bank on the Ukraine growth report, and it's very clear that with all the inputs being in a much better situation than Poland, with which we have to catch up hopefully sooner than the years that report presented, it's very clear that with all the inputs, our output is much smaller, and in order to improve it, we need to address 3 main areas. First, the productivity, and it's clear what we have to do in order to address the productivity. Second is trade and all the international, our access to the markets, all our free trade agreements, everything, all the investments that we can get into the country. I mean, I'm talking trade in general, like trade and movement of capital. But most importantly, the third item is resilient institutions, is the professional Ministry of Finance, it's the independent and professional National Bank. It's all the institutions that will work and be in place, and the number of them are already in place, that investors will not be asking about any elections as a potential disaster, because the institutions will be in place, and then political process as in any democracy. And I'm proud that we do have a democracy. We don't know who will be the president, and we don't know yet who, what composition of the Verkhovna Rada we will have. But all the reforms that we are doing, and it will take a little bit of time, will, as the result, have more resilient institutions that will answer a lot of questions regardless of where political process is.
It's an interesting list, and it goes to what Carl Bildt was talking about, whether there's reform fatigue in Ukraine. And Gosta, you know, you're here to maintain feet to the fire to make sure that there's no IMF fatigue, so long as there's reform fatigue. And how do you see that stacking up for 2019? I mean, is the IMF pretty relaxed now about where Ukraine is, now that you've got your standby? I mean, IMF's never relaxed, but I mean, relatively speaking, relaxed about where things are moving. And what do you see as the key challenges in order to maintain that dialogue and the relationship to take it even further, the one that Oksana was just describing?
So we're now on the third IMF program since the crisis of 2014 and 15, and we have the same assessment of the underlying economy and what needs to be done now that we had in 2014. The positive news is that things have been done. So things have been achieved over the past 5 years, and that has resolved many of the imbalances and distortions that were really the cause of the crisis. I mean, the monetary policy framework that has been introduced is it completely changes the picture. Now a focus on maintaining a low and stable inflation, and allowing the exchange rate to adjust to, and the resolute approach to resolving the imbalances in the banking sector. So the comprehensive assessment of banks, the introduction of the approaching regulation and supervision of banking sector to international standards, and closing down more than 100 banks that were not viable. Also, in last year, or a year and a half ago, the pension reform that substantially improves the long-term sustainability of the pension system. It really is an important step towards fiscal sustainability. Many anti-corruption institutions have been introduced. and they we have not seen a radical change in the level of corruption, but this puts in place the institutions that can be used to address corruption. And also the improvement of public procurement, which is a big step in the right direction. This, of course, doesn't mean that everything has been done. So, as we heard from several of the previous speakers, there are lots of things that remain to be done. What I find encouraging is that there's such a consensus on what remains to be done. There's a consensus among external analysts, among IFIs, and also within the government. We hear the president, we hear the prime minister, we hear the governor of the central bank and the finance minister basically all saying the same things about the things that need to be done. So a land reform, making it possible to buy and sell agricultural land, and importantly use agricultural land as collateral for when borrowing and making investment into the agricultural sector. The privatization of state-owned enterprises. The state-owned enterprise sector is for historical reasons, very big. It's also unreformed and is inefficient. And here it's important that these things are offloaded to the private sector that has the right incentives to make investments and modernization and make this a contribution to the Ukrainian economy. Then other reforms that we view as being crucial is removing remaining price controls on domestic gas. This is a distortion, and it is a source of corruption, and it prevents the development of the energy sector. Also, an important reform that is just now starting is the reform of the revenue administrations, of tax administration and customs administration, and this is important both for the government's ability to collect all the taxes that are due, but also as an improvement to the business environment. So overall, I think it is important to keep in mind that a lot has been achieved over the past 5 years, and demonstrating, if nothing else, that it is possible in Ukraine to do reforms, but that the agenda is still long for reforms that need to be done to modernize Ukraine's economy.
Well, thanks very much. You raised the other elephant in the room, so I'll introduce that as well, called the issue of corruption. And I think there's a lot of talk, but there's a lot of misperception as well about what we mean when we talk about that. There's been an independent study I saw recently done by one of the economic institutes in Kiev that calculated that the government's prevention mechanisms, so the institutional means of preventing corruption, has actually saved the state budget since 2015 $6 billion, which amounts to something like 6% of Ukraine's GDP. I think that the comments earlier by some of the speakers about the fact that perhaps we haven't been robust enough in putting people in prison, maybe, I mean, I have my own list that I'd be happy to share, but I think that the issue that you raised about state-owned enterprises, et cetera, is interesting, and we'll hear from Minister Saienko in a minute about the corporate governance efforts. I mean, I'm also vice chairman of Ukrainian Railways, and we've just started arguably one of the worst offenders historically in this regard, and we just had the chairman of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau saying that he's seen a significant change in approach, and I can tell you we're putting mechanisms. So this institutional reform that needs to take place is actually an anti-corruption measure as well, I think, and I think that it bears mentioning. something that was mentioned earlier about the vested interest, I think, Ambassador Mingarelli. I think that's really where we need to focus the efforts going forward. And Minister Saienko, I mean, you have the small task of reforming Ukraine's governing institutions and overseeing state-owned enterprise, corporate governance reform, and privatization. Nobody would guess this from a title called the Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers. And this issue of systemic reforms, like we come back to Oksana's comment about institutions, that we didn't inherit any Ukrainian institutions to fall back on when we left, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So essentially we're building a country from scratch, and we basically started 5 years ago because we had basically people that took advantage and built a kleptocracy for that period of time. So we have to get rid of the legacy of the Soviet Union. We got to get rid of the legacy of the kleptocratic interests that controlled many parts of the economy. So we have this problem of institutional capacity. What's the government now doing in order to try to build new mechanics of governance and a proper decision-making process?
Yeah. No, thank you, Bill. I guess then it's a very important and essential issue, and I would like to start with mentions what Carl Bildt said. He says that in 1991, so Ukraine had just huge talents, technical talents, and had some industry, but we hadn't an independent government. That's why I guess this key priorities reform for us is the reforms which helps to transfer our post-Soviet system of governance to the governance 4.0. That's why very important such reforms as, for example, deregulation. We get rid of thousands and hundreds of different post-Soviet acts. We deal with corporate governance you mentioned. It's very important because Ukraine has a very wide sector of the property. We have a lot of state enterprises, more than
3,500.
Yeah, you're right. So it's very important to start a very effective process of privatization. We actually, thanks to the parliament supported the government loan privatization, and it's quite good. We introduced the English law, etc., and we see the first results of the small privatization, and also 2019 years very important for us to start the large privatization.
What have been the results of the small privatization? What do you see as the key achievements?
So the started price in some cases increasing several times. For example, for some cases 10, 15 times.
They've been on Prozoro, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you put them on
that's why it's very important, the competitive markets, for example, in the sphere of, in the rent sphere, in the property sphere, in energy sphere, because the competitiveness and open, transparent markets, it's also very crucial institutional reform in Ukraine. And you mentioned the corporate governance, very important to change the system, how we manage the state enterprise. I mean the strategic state enterprises. You know that we created a nomination committee, which is responsible for the recruitment process for top management and in supervisory board for state enterprises. Now we have 5 or 6 the first cases, and it's very important to understand how to transfer the power to the mandate of the ministry, the state bodies. They should not interfere in some operational things in enterprises. They should know what is KPI, how to deal with the performance assessment, how we work with the supervisory board, with management. So it's a very essential issue also, but very important. And you mentioned the reform of governance. Now the citizens, the business, the situation is that they don't want to be as observers of the government decision. The people, they want to be engaged in this decision. Look to some private sector, Google, Facebook. They know a lot about the people, what they eat, what they see, what is their habits. The same situation is government. So we should to change our system of governance from post-Soviet administrative system to system which engages the people, which is transparent, which use open data, big data, and to propose to citizens services, good services. So I guess the institutional reforms could make our system, our process irreversible. And this is very important.
One of the Prime Minister mentioned that one of the most important structural reforms that have taken place since independence was decentralization.
Yeah.
What has the impact of that been on, in terms of the vertical of power, the sort of post-Soviet vertical of power, and how has that impacted on the reforms in public administration that you're pursuing?
Yeah, when we came in 2014.
У 2014 році всі бюджети, всі гроші були централізовані під урядом, під Кабінетом міністрів. І відповідальність місцевого самоврядування була дуже обмежена. Тобто, коли ми запропонували передати кошти і відповідальність, і мандат до місцевих органів самоврядування, зараз ми бачимо результати. Тобто місцеві бюджети підвищилися в кілька разів. Вони залишають собі 60% отриманих прибутків з податків. Так, і вони можуть зараз залучати інвесторів, залучати бізнес. Вони можуть створювати успішні умови для роботи бізнесу в своїх спільнотах. І це може вплинути на місцеву економіку, поліпшити місцеву економіку як частину державної економіки. З точки зору інвестицій, які ми залучаємо до країни, потрібно звертати увагу на регіонах. Ми маємо брати до уваги не лише міста, але й нові об'єднані територіальні громади. І територію довкола них. Це робить їх більш економічно привабливими. І фактично це такі підприємливі люди, тому що у них вже є інтереси, які вони готові захищати. Звичайно.
З небес спустилися на нашу грішну землю.
Yakiv, we have moved from the heavens to the ground. And the new law on currency regulation is now becoming effective. A lot of comments are made now that this will entail a radical transformation of the household budgets and enterprises and of small and large. How do you see the further development of this new system? Using this opportunity, when the new law on foreign currency regulation has only been adopted 4 days ago, 4 banking days ago, I would like to congratulate everyone on the new currency regulation law that is meant to replace the old decree that has been effective for more than 26 years. What happened on the 7th of February? Almost 30 improvements have been introduced for business that were previously banned by the decree on currency regulation. I'll just name a few of them to give the idea on what kind of improvements this is giving the business. The repatriation is increased to 7 million per month. T plus several days reservation of hryvnia to buy foreign currency has been cancelled. Currently, if business believes they want to sell currency or buy currency, they can do this without reservation. Maximum terms of transactions of foreign economic activity are reduced from 180 to 365 days. They're increased. Free use of foreign accounts is used. The loans from non-residents do not have to be registered anymore. The law also alleviates the opportunity for early settlement of loans by non-residents. The sanctions for violation of foreign economic activity and time of transactions are cancelled. the norm will the new norm will introduce reduction of compulsory sale of foreign currency will be reduced from 50 to 30%. And the new things, the newly introduced norms have made it possible for the people to buy currency online from the banks who could provide this in a technological level and give such access to their clients. And currently, this opportunity is there. It's working 24/7. In the past, people could only buy that at the exchange points or at the banks. Also, the transfer of currency transfers abroad have been increased from 15,000 hryvnias equivalent to 150,000. The limitations of investments abroad have been expanded, broadened. Currently, they could transfer up to 50,000 euros per year, a legal entity up to 2 million euros per year, and these terms will be reviewed as soon as the macroeconomic situation allows us to do that. But full liberalization of the movement of capital will be impossible without the adoption of another few laws. One of them is prevention of alleviation of basic taxation, which is the outflow of capital from Ukraine to countries with easier tax regime. Also, declaration or liberalization of declaration of assets abroad. Without those things, the movement of capital will be impossible. This is further development of integration in the international financial systems, correct. We also need to adopt a number of laws for equal functioning and regulation of all financial institutions operating in Ukraine, not just banking sector, so-called law on that. So currently, as I understand you on this agenda, this is a lot of things to do. We doubt this would happen before the end of this year with all the parliamentary and presidential elections. Well, the hope always dies last. We will continue hoping that there will be enough space for this in the parliament to consolidate the votes and vote for the laws necessary for these efforts. Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist and I wouldn't be here if I weren't an optimist. Similarly, I would also like to say, if you were to ask about the banking system a bit, this is probably the biggest achievement that the external world knows best from the National Bank. The banking system has been regulated. How do you see further steps? What are the next steps that you expect for further integration of the banking system in the country, in the global systems? Currently, the National Bank and the banking system are implementing Basel principles. We have moved to risk-oriented approaches, introduced new liquidity tools, quick liquidity controls. We've also introduced the new international accounting standards. We are not lagging behind, and we're moving in line with the modern European and international principles. Wonderful, wonderful. I'll be looking forward to that. To be able to never have anything to do with the cash. Yeah, it's moving very fast. The task of the National Bank for this year is to reduce the amount of cash in circulation, expansion of cashless transactions, because for us, as the National Bank, servicing cash is too expensive.
I read a study that becoming one of the fastest implementers of a cashless society in Europe. And Oksana, you don't like cashless anything because the Minister of Finance, you want revenues. We're talking about, you mentioned the investment climate, and what sort of fiscal policies do you see pursuing in 2019 to further more investment into the country. And maybe you could comment on the implications of the changes or the proposed changes to the state tax administration and the customs. And what are the implications of that?
Well, I actually like cashless because it means more revenues for the budget, the more cashless we are.
There you
so
go.
we are totally aligned here with the National Bank, and we have actually prepared the draft law together on the BEPS implementation steps, which hopefully we will review and we'll have a chance to present in the Parliament and discuss with the parliamentarians. But in general, I think we have to, again, we have a very interesting task for 2019. On the one hand, to become very prudent and disciplined and conservative in a sense, to preserve the macroeconomic stability. So if you look at what are we implementing at the ministry, but it's not just the ministry, it's on the cabinet level and more wider. First is the midterm budgeting implementation. The 3-year budgeting is not about planning for 3 years. It's not only about that. It's a totally new type of budgeting with the new fiscal rules, with the new budget rules, with the binding ceilings for 3 years. I think for you as investors, it's one of the most important documents, even though it sounds very boring and very Ministry of Finance. Because essentially, right now we have the program with the IMF, and we have the association agreement, and we have our programs and reform matrices with the World Bank and other IFIs. And, you know, the concessional lending from IFIs remain our top priority. It's long, it's cheap, it's tied to reforms. We definitely, in our debt strategy, you also can see that this is the main priority, and we want to expand, if anything, the concessional lending, and then, you know, be able to enter the market when the market is ready and want us at the market. But again, the concessional lending is very important. But the midterm budgeting is the key document in any country for investors to clearly see where we are going. What is the fiscal policies that are going to be implemented in 3 years? What are the tax rates that will be there? What expenditures are priority for us, not only in the strategic plans, but what priorities are supported by the budget expenditures? I think what our government has been really effective during the past years we clearly set a couple of key priorities at the beginning of the year, and we have reached them. 3 years ago, we spoke about healthcare reform, and it took us a year, and we adopted the law, and now we're in the implementation. 4 years ago, we spoke about decentralization. Now everyone thinks it's a given. The decentralization is here. In 2015, when I just joined the ministry, we discussed with the IMF the first concept of the midterm budgeting implementation and started writing the new budget code together. It's a reality today. So I think putting a clear priorities and then achieving them, and then on the basis of them, preserving, of course, of the achievements, but move forward, is the main goal for Ukraine and how we can achieve our goals going forward. Because essentially, having some challenges in a lot of areas and having areas that were not developed for years, if not decades, it's a challenge, but on the other hand, it's a big opportunity. Those in the room, and I see a couple of people, Roman, Volodya, who remember the banking system in early 90s, when we became independent Ukraine this time, we did not have a very good banking system, and we were behind, you know, couple of decades from Europe. Instead of catching up on what we missed, we leapfrogged, and we built at that time one of the best payment systems, the fastest, and we skipped, you know, the paper checks for the population. We moved to and now the cashless, as Daniel said, is more spread in Ukraine than in other places. We do have the same opportunity in other areas. In healthcare, in education, we can leapfrog, and we can actually take lessons from our partners and from our colleagues in Europe and build something already taken into account, first of all, how the world has changed, the innovations, the IT, the new conditions, but also repair the problems that we had in the system. Briefly mentioning on the SFS reform, I think we have developed the concept, adopted at the cabinet level in December, and we already started the split of the state fiscal service into two entities, the revenue or the tax administration and the customs. Why I think it's important, and I mean the split is not the reform in itself, but I think it's a necessary precondition to reform both entities and essentially reconstruct them from scratch. They do have a very different functions, and while in the tax administration there has been a lot done with the electronic cabinet, with the VAT tax refunds, with a lot of improvements, and we have to deepen and continue these changes inside to make the tax service more friendly, more actually client-oriented, for the law-abiding, for the good business, and a very strict and law enforcement entity for the business that is trying to do all kinds of tax evasion.
Nobody in this room, clearly.
Absolutely. But the custom area is first and foremost a security and economic security function, but it's also a very important infrastructure function for us to develop trade, for us to develop investments, and for us to ensure that there is a level playing field for all businesses, Ukrainian and international, in Ukraine. So it's a very complex reform. I don't want to mislead you to say that it's going to be very easy. It's probably one of the most difficult reforms we have to do. It's one of the most important reforms for business. From the ministry, I can say, and we have a big task force that combines the ministry, other ministries, IFIs, deputies. It's a very big group of people that is working on it, and we will do everything possible to make it as, unnoticeable for business as possible, so that when you notice it, it's when you will notice that it started working much better, but not the transitional period.
We have, thank you, Oksana. The Prime Minister has said, you mentioned earlier about the fact that we've achieved 3.4% year-on-year growth, which is the highest in the last 7 years. But our boss sets the bar a little higher and says, Prime Minister says we need 5 to 7%. We need 5 basically to catch up to Poland, and we need 7 to get us over the hump. So Josta, from the IMF's perspective, Oksana gave a very extensive list of priorities and an agenda for the government. What would be the top 3 from your perspective to help us reach that 5 to 7% year-on-year growth stage?
So, first of all, it is true that while it's of course positive to have growth, and while growth here looks it looks good in comparison with European countries, Ukraine is still below its 2013 GDP level. And so just to catch up to where Ukraine was in 2013, there's a long way to go. And then if we start talking about catching up with Poland, we need to have, Poland is growing and has been growing since 2000 at 4% per year. So yes, 3%, 3.5%, that's good. But actually, Ukraine is not catching up. The distance to Poland is widening. So what's needed? A precondition for sustained growth is to preserve macro stability, and that's why this is such a focus for all of the IMF programs, and why it's such a focus for this program. And it is to bring inflation down to within the target, preserve the external stability, keep the current account deficit at a reasonable level, at a level that can be financed, and to keep fiscal sustainability and reduce the public debt. On top of that was needed. That's the precondition. But Ukraine needs investment. Investment needs to come in. Right now, foreign direct investment is Dragon Capital estimated that the investment in the real economy is about $1.5 billion. That's, for Ukraine, that's peanuts. It should be a multiple of that in order to really get economic growth. What's needed for that, but also what Ukraine needs is domestic investment. So continue to strengthen the banking sector, continue the reforms that the National Bank is doing in terms of ensuring that there is sufficient capital, that that banks don't build up excessive risks, and ensure that the supervision is adequate. That's a crucial reform. The other one reform is to privatize and reduce the size of the state-owned enterprise sector, and actually reduce the size of the state banking sector, which it now is more than half of banking sector assets are in state-owned banks. This right now, as I said earlier, the state-owned enterprise sector is not contributing to the development of Ukraine because the right incentives are not there, and it hasn't been modernized as it should have been. And then the third reform that's important is to really unlock the potential of perhaps Ukraine's biggest assets, which is the agricultural sector, and allow a free trade in agricultural land.
Thank you very much, Minister Saienko. There you go. There's the game plan. What are the top 3 priorities from your standpoint in terms of right-sizing and creating an efficient state administration to help achieve those goals, to facilitate the goals that we've been talking about?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I totally agree with these priorities, but the problem is to be succeed in it, so we need to transform and to improve the system of governance in Ukraine. So it's a problem also, not only the institutional capacity, but the problem of our lack of the capacity in the ministry. That's why we started quite a comprehensive reform of public administration. For example, if we're talking about the ministries, so they know that they mostly manage the state enterprises. For example, we're talking about the Ministry of Economy, more than 1,500 enterprises under the Ministry of Economy. So, and all these operational issues in one of the huge part of the mandate, all their responsibilities, the Ministry of Economy. So it's very important to transfer the function of the ministers from such direct management to create a very effective policy centers which deal with policies, which know what is a policy analysis is, which is able to provide some consultation with public, with key stakeholders, and to
strategic planning
and to present to the government and to implement very effective the government decision. And also we're talking about how to change the behavior culture of the civil servants, because now in 21st century, very important, we understand that the system needs new competencies, leading changes, leadership, how to work with big data, not some technical competencies which were needed in the 19th or 20th century. The third one, we also need to introduce a new system of the performance management to try to identify the key priorities, the KPIs, and to focus on them. What Oksana Markarova talked about. So all these things, it's not very attractive to how to communicate to the public also this sphere, but it's very important. The institutional capacity and these changes is crucial if you want to reach this set of goals.
Excellent. I think we have some time. I take some questions. Maybe I'll take 3 at a time to get in if there's that level of interest. Any questions? Wow, you were pretty convincing. Yeah. Yes.
Question.
Gentleman over here.
Andrew Matheny, Goldman Sachs. The Ukrainian hryvnia has been one of the best performing currencies in the last couple of years. Double-digit real appreciation.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone just a little?
Sorry, the Ukrainian hryvnia has been one of the best performing currencies in the past couple of years. Double-digit real appreciation. You at the same time have seen the current account deficit widen somewhat. Net export performance has been pretty lackluster. This is really a question for everyone, but in particular for the NBU. Are you seeing signs that the currency is becoming overvalued, and are you concerned that the tight monetary policy stance, may be having unintended consequences in this way?
Чи гривня переоцінена? Гривня завищена вартість.
Це запитання.
This question correlates with the Big Mac index, basically. And it is asked on multiple occasions to the leaders of the National Bank. We're saying that the value of services, the cost of services is different in different countries, and it's different in Ukraine as well. So comparing the structure of product outside Ukraine and within Ukraine would be illogical because the components have different form, including the net cost of production, the delivery costs, the labor costs, and all other components related therein. So comparing whether it's overappreciated or underappreciated, it's a bit illogical.
Well, no, I think I shouldn't comment on the question. That's a clear sign that there is no fiscal dominance here, so I'm not asking questions like this from the National Bank.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, David Bijashvili, the founder of the Georgian Investment Group. We're interested in privatization, and straight away I'd like to say that we believe in Ukraine. We will continue investing in Ukraine. We already have pilot projects, and we will participate in the big privatization as well. And the team's intent on reforms is quite encouraging. The figures we hear give us a lot of optimism to solve these questions on privatization. And of course, there are some difficulties that we are facing in the process of privatization, of small privatization. No question there. Everything operates well on the basic level. On the big privatization, there are certain questions related to the legal nuances, and we're hiring big legal companies, auditor companies. We come to the state property funds. They give us their template of contracts, and their template is usually useless. So a request to the minister is to perhaps change some kind of rules to give advantage to international contracts so that we could use English contracts, our templates, to litigate in the London court, whatnot, and engage and introducing more of international standards in the privatization process. And the team will do everything possible to make this a transparent process, so the intent is there and we'll participate.
Yes, sir. Sir, can we have a mic here, please? Oh, sorry, you grabbed the mic ahead of you. Sorry, it's
stuck in there.
No worries. You'll be next.
From Spinnaker Capital in London.
Little can't hear you. A little closer.
Quick question for you guys. Now that we have you all up here, so we've seen in several other programs, IMF programs, especially Argentina now prolifically, that the IMF is channeling money, their disbursements to the FIN. Is that something that would certainly be helpful for the finance ministry, it would seem? Is that something that the National Bank would be comfortable with? Is that something that the finance ministry would find useful? And is that something that the IMF would contemplate, that instead of continuing to bolster reserves that and leaving Ukraine at the reliance on volatile Eurobond markets for financing, that it would move those disbursements to the MinFin.
Before the
Josta, I didn't
finance,
ask.
clearly
finance
directed
minister
to you,
or the
Josta.
governor says something that will make me uncomfortable, perhaps I can comment on that. It is, formally, it is possible for disbursements to go to the budget. There are some particular requirements for that. There's a policy for dispersing, for making IMF disbursements to the budget. I mean, in the first SBA of 2014, we had disbursements to the budget. The first disbursement under the EFF also went to the budget. We are not, we haven't discussed that in this SBA. We have no plans to do that for the simple reason that we don't see that it is necessary. The budget is fully financed, and there's no reason to make the IMF disbursement to the budget. There is also good arguments to continue to build up reserves in the central bank. So all the disbursement under the SBA will go to the central bank.
Well, just to add to that, I think when we have discussed the program together with the IMF and the National Bank, it's just to confirm, technically it is possible, but in 2019 we have adopted a very prudent budget, where yes, there are some challenges, and almost a third of the budget goes to the debt servicing and debt repayment, but we are developing the local market extensively. Hopefully in the next couple of months the clear stream will be on, and it will make it even easier for investors to invest into our papers inside. We want to see more in hryvnia to rationalize our portfolio here. With regard to having the money into the budget, yes, we had it in 2014 when it was frankly impossible to get it from anywhere else. But now when we have in this situation and we have a solid program with the IMF, it actually opens door for other concessional lending which goes into the budget. And we have been working very extensively with the World Bank. You know, there is one guarantee which essentially is issued, approved, and we are closing soon the full utilization of that. We are discussing about the future potential instruments like that. I think it's a very good instrument in a sense because it decreases our costs. Also we have the instrument from the European Union, the macrofinancial assistance. Why is it important for us? Again, as I said, it's long, it's cheap or cheaper than if we would go to the market. It's related to the market, so it's not that we're completely out of the market, and we're actually building the presence on the market with having such an institutions as guarantors. But also what is important is that it's tied to our reform plan. So it's not just, money for money, it's also money that proves that we are moving in the right direction, and that, if anything, I think makes it easier for us to think about the market accesses. So again, this is the priority. We did not plan, and we do not plan in 2019 to ask IMF to reconsider. I think this program is a well-planned program, and we just have to stick and do it. Whether we will be able to graduate from this program, well, our three-year budgeting figures show that probably not, but we should work towards it. We should target. National Bank is very good at targeting inflation. We are starting targeting our decreased deficit, and in the future, hopefully surplus. So, it will take a little bit of time. Again, when we talk about reforms, I just want to bring the notion of time, because we work together with my colleagues in Europe. It took Poland 10 years to do the decentralization reform. It took France more than 10 years to do the budgetary reform. We know that we have been behind in 2015 and 2014-15, so we had to move really quick. And yes, the expectation that we have to do more and we have to do quicker, but reforms do take years to be fully implemented, and then they take years for people to feel the results of these reforms. So in some of the areas, especially in the complex areas like finance, we all know we just have to have patience, and as in the past, I mean,
Keep going.
Yeah, being a mom, I mean, I remember, when your kids are really small and you're like exhausted and you don't know, and my mom gave me advice, you just keep doing what you are doing and it will become better. So we just have to keep doing what we are doing. It's the right thing, but we just have to stay the course.
I'll take the last question here.
It was actually the same.
Same question. Then it's the last question here. That was good, Oksana. You're capturing the...
Julian Adams from Atlante. We were in McDonald's yesterday, and a Big Mac is 54 hryvnia, which seems very reasonable on the world stage. But I would like to ask Minister Oksana, if you're issuing external debt in dollars that you're paying nearly 10% in yield, how do you expect to reduce your debt to GDP?
Well, that's exactly what I said before, and it's clearly written in our 3-year debt management strategy. That's why our priority is concessional lending. That's why we want to widen it, because essentially we have achieved a lot already this year. We do have the target to decrease the debt to GDP to under 50% in 3 years. It means that we have to first grow our GDP, but also to decrease the debt. Of course, 10%, I mean, we cannot go against the market. The market is what it is, right? So we just have to continue the reforms, improve the rule of law, do everything that will, at the end, result in a much cheaper lending for us. It takes time. So, of course, if we can supplement and get more concessional and cheap lending, we would be very glad, and we're actively pursuing that, because you are absolutely right. We don't want to borrow very highly. It will not be sustainable in the long term, and we have clear not only goals, but we clearly have also the path to achieving these goals.
And I think
by the way, I would encourage everyone, I mean, we are putting a lot of information online. I do believe in transparency, and we do have our chief economist in the room, Oleksandr. So we are trying to share as much information. We started 3 years ago with opening all transactions of the Ukrainian treasury. I think we're one of the very few countries even in Europe that is doing that. We also put the budget online. It's the open budget. It's not only the budget, but the budgeting process is fully opened for the population. We are working now to make all this information also available in English, not only in Ukrainian, but also in English. You can see our debt management strategy. All the papers are on our site, so please take a look. There is contact information there. Minfin is ready to answer your questions on a daily basis.
And I think that this is a great place to sort of end up and summarize on this issue of institutional reform. I mean, the context, it's one thing to say, well, they haven't done this, and they haven't done this, and they haven't done this. 5 years ago, we had a near-death experience. We lost 20% of our GDP when the Russians invaded Ukraine. We had 20% of our GDP lost, 60% of the value of the currency, 7% of our territory. We had $5,000 in the government's consolidated accounts, and less than 1 month's worth of gold reserves to cover imports. 70% of our trade was cut off by our major trading partner. And, we today have 3.4% growth. We have macroeconomic stability, all the things that we've talked about today. And it's a remarkable transformation, and it's largely been driven by the demands of civil society. And I come back to this, the point that Ambassador Mingarelli made, that is what makes the reform process and Ukraine's integration into European Union and Euro-Atlantic structures irreversible, because the people will not stand for anything less. And believe me, in the government, we feel it every single day. And the idea of transparency as being the hallmark of both anti-corruption as well as institutional reform, you see it all across the board. And the examples that Oksana made, going to Prozoro, in Ukrzaliznytsia, we had a huge problem of corruption in the distribution of freight wagons. And we put them on Prozoro to find out what the actual market price was. And we had lots of complaints from our customers because saying the price is going up. And we said, well, that's because that's going to the market price. And so we're more and more using these kinds of things to try to be as open, transparent, and accessible as possible. Because frankly, as Oleksandr pointed out, we do not have the institutional capacity to deal with all of these problems all at the same time. And we don't have the institutions in which to actually put the institutional capacity if we had that. So we have to use these technologies. We need to move forward with the new thinking and being on the cutting edge in a country the size of France with 40 million people. And I think it's accurate. I can't remember whether it was Carl Bildt or Hugues Mingarelli that alluded to the fact that and I'll paraphrase, that no country anywhere has done more in the last 5 years to transform its society and its economy. And, you know, as we are building these institutions from scratch, you know, we're dismantling the Soviet-era institutions at the same time as building institutions of modern democratic institutions of governance. It's sort of like building an aircraft carrier while you're at sea with a handful of qualified engineers in the middle of a hurricane while you're under fire. And 5% of our GDP goes to security and defense. That's a whopping great sum for a poor country. So I think that the message, the takeaways for this audience is that we are irreversibly on the road to improving and further integrating our Ukraine into Europe and Euro-Atlantic structures. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I'd like to thank the panel. Join me in thanking that panel for their time and contributions. Have a great rest of the conference.